It had been one of those lazy nights, the kind where no one really had a plan, but didn't want to call it quits either. The four of us were packed into Greg's basement, sprawled across old beanbags and couch cushions that smelled faintly of dust and cheap cologne. Someone had dug out a pack of old Marlboros, and Greg had tossed on some album that was mostly static and ghostly guitar riffs. Tommy was doing his best impression of our principal, using a deep, absurd voice, much to everyone's amusement. I leaned back against the wall, watching my friends goof around and trying to tune out a low-grade sense of restlessness. It was rare these days that we got to just hang out like this, with everyone busy, part-time jobs, classes, family stuff. We were lucky to get a few hours together, let alone a whole evening. I was grateful for it, even if it was just hanging out in a musty basement, swapping bad jokes. We had spent the last hour eating stale chips and debating whether it was worth going out for food, but every time we got close to agreeing, someone would start up another conversation, and we would all settle back down. Kev was in the middle of a story about some disastrous date he'd had last week when my phone buzzed, the sound cutting through the quiet laughter and casual hum of the night. I didn't think much of it at first, probably my mom asking when I'd be home, or some random group text lighting up. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw my sister's name, glowing urgently in the dim light. It was rare for her to call this late, even rarer for her to call me at all. We got along fine, but our lives don't exactly overlap. She was younger, more into her own scene, and she usually kept me out of her business. "Hang on a sec," I mumbled, stepping away from the group to answer the call. I could tell right away something was off. I didn't even have to say hello. Her voice was rushed, almost a whisper, and there was noise in the background, music, people arguing, someone yelling like they were way too drunk. "Casey?" she said, her voice almost swallowed up by the noise. "Hey, can you come pick me up?" Yeah, sure," I replied, thrown off by the tension in her voice. "You okay?" There was a pause, the sound of her moving away from the crowd. "Not really," she admitted, a strain in her voice. "The party's getting weird. We have a situation. I don't know how to explain it, but can you just get here fast?" That was all it took. I glanced back at the guys, all of whom had gone silent, listening in as I finished the call. "We gotta go," I said, feeling a prickle of worry. I didn't explain, but they didn't ask. They all just stood, shaking off the comfort of the night and grabbing their jackets, feeling a shared sense of urgency settle over them. "Guess we're going for a drive," Kev said, trying to keep it light as we all piled into Greg's car. But even he was quieter than usual, and I could feel my own tension spreading to the others. Greg's car rattled as it picked up speed, the low hum of the engine filling the silence that had settled over us. I sat in the passenger seat, my fingers drumming nervously against my thigh as I tried to explain where we are headed. We all knew the city well, but even I wasn't exactly sure where this party was, and every turn we took seemed to make the streets feel less familiar. "So, she told me it was somewhere off East Monroe," I said, staring out the windshield. "It's this big old house at the end of the block. She said it's the one with the porch lights that flicker." Greg nodded, his eyes fixed on the road, though his shoulders were tense, hands gripped a little too tightly around the wheel. "East Monroe. There's nothing but old houses down there, right? People usually don't throw parties there." "That's what I thought," I replied, glancing at Greg. "But I guess some college kid's renting it now. Or maybe they just snuck in. Either way, she said it was packed." Tommy leaned forward from the back seat, his voice a low murmur. "Did she say why she wanted to leave so bad?" I shook my head. "Not really. She just sounded different. Said there was some situation." "Situation?" Kev asked, his voice filled with forced lightness, trying to break the tension. "You think there's something shady going on?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to put it into words, but her voice had sounded wrong. Like there was something she was afraid to say, something she didn't even want to put into words over the phone. "Nah, nothing like that," I finally said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Probably just some people got too drunk or whatever. "But let's just get there quick, all right?" The streetlights threw long, uneven shadows as we drove, and I felt the weight of those shadows settling around us. The houses passed by, silent and dark, like they were holding secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that the city was different tonight, emptier, darker, like something was crouched just beyond the glow of the headlights watching. Tommy, sensing the mood, let out a shaky laugh. "Man, you guys are acting like we're about to walk into some horror movie," he said, though his voice was a little too loud, a little too forced. "It's just a party. We pick her up, and we're out of there in 5 minutes. "Right," Greg muttered, glancing at me. 5 minutes in and out. We pulled up a few houses down, parking under a half-dead tree that cast warped shadows across the hood of Greg's car. The house we were looking at, the one my sister had described, was at the end of the block, its dim porch light flickering in a slow, irregular pattern. But everything else about it seemed off. Greg cut the engine, and the silence hit us like a weight. No bass thumping from inside the house, no laughter drifting out into the night, no sounds of people spilling onto the porch for a smoke or some air. The place looked abandoned, except for the dim yellow light over the door, swaying slightly in the breeze. It was a big house, 3 stories tall, the kind of place that felt like it had its own ghost stories. The windows were dark, and the yard was overgrown, as if no one had cared for it in years. "You sure this is the right spot, man?" Kev asked from the back, leaning forward to get a better look. He squinted, peering through the darkness like he could will the place to look more lively. "This should be it," I said, pulling out my phone and trying to call my sister. I waited, listening to the ringing, but it went to voicemail. "Maybe they all went somewhere else," Tommy offered, though even he sounded unconvinced. "Or it ended early. I mean, it's almost 1 in the morning." I shook my head, staring hard at the house. She'd have texted me if she was leaving, or if she needed a ride somewhere else. But she hadn't texted, hadn't left me any clue except her tense, hurried call. Greg took a deep breath, glancing nervously at all of us before nodding toward the house. "Maybe we should just go up, check it out. If she's not there, we'll head out, but at least we'll know." None of us moved at first, as if the idea of actually going up to the house had caught us all off guard. But then I opened the door, breaking the spell, and one by one, the rest followed, stepping out onto the quiet, empty street. We walked slowly, each step echoing a little too loudly in the silence, as if we were the only people left in the city. The street was lined with darkened houses, every window empty and watching, giving me the eerie sense that something was waiting. I led the way, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, with Greg right behind me, my gaze fixed on the house, as if I was hoping my sister would step onto the porch. As we reached the sidewalk, Kev glanced at us and whispered, "This place looks like it hasn't seen a party in decades. Are we sure this isn't like someone's grandma's house?" Tommy chuckled, a nervous sound that broke too soon. "If she's waiting for us inside that place, I'm not going in without a weapon." "Relax," I muttered. I wasn't sure why the house felt so wrong, but it did, and I couldn't shake it. We climbed the creaky steps to the porch, and I tried to call my sister one more time, letting it ring as we started at the cracked, peeling front door. It felt like the night was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. When, all of a sudden, the door started to creak. It swung open slowly, as if someone, or something, inside had been watching us the whole time, waiting for us to come close. The hinges moaned, loud in the night, and the door opened just enough to reveal pitch-black darkness inside. It was so dark it seemed to swallow the light from the street, an unnatural kind of dark, as if it didn't want us to see what lays within. Greg swallowed, his hand hovering just inches from the door, and my heart was racing, each beat louder than the last. And then, finally, my sister picked up her phone. "Casey?" Her voice was low, urgent, barely more than a whisper. "Casey, listen to me. I'm not in the house anymore. I don't know how to explain it, but you need to leave. Now, don't ask questions. Just get out of there, please." Her words hit me like ice water, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked around at my friends, who were watching me with tense, anxious expressions. "But," I started to say, but she cut me off. "Casey, please. You and your friends need to go before—" "What the hell?" Kev shouted, his hands clawing at the ground as he tried to crawl backward, away from the small, pale hand clutching his ankle. My phone almost dropped as I looked down. A girl was lying there on the edge of the porch, half hidden by shadows, her face twisted in pain. Her skin was ashen, her clothes torn and stained with dark patches of blood. She looked barely conscious, her eyes half closed. "Oh my God," Tommy whispered, his face pale as he backed up, his eyes glued to the girl. I knelt down, trying to shake off the panic racing through me. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you okay? What happened?" The girl's eyes flickered open just a sliver, and she looked at me, her gaze distant and hollow, as if she was staring through me. Her lips moved, but at first, no sound came out. Then, with what seemed like the last of her strength, she whispered, a voice so faint it barely reached me over the silence, "Please." The word slipped out barely more than a breath, and her grip on Kev's ankle loosened as her head fell back, her body going limp. Kev scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in horror as he backed away, pointing a shaky finger at the girl's motionless body. "Is she dead?" The question hung in the air as we all fell silent, each of us holding our breath. Then, without warning, the girl's eyes snapped open, wide and wild, gleaming with a fierce, unnatural yellow light. Before any of us could react, she lunged at Kev, her once delicate hands twisting into claws that glinted in the dim light, razor-sharp and curved like talons. Her face had changed, her mouth stretched into a twisted, furious grin that showed teeth too sharp, too many. Kev barely had time to scream before her clawed hand latched onto his shoulder, digging in with a speed that didn't belong to someone so dead, so broken. Blood began to bloom through his clothes as her claws sank deeper, and his scream cut through the night, filled with terror and pain. "Get off him!" Greg shouted, panic in his voice. He charged forward, his foot slamming into the side of the girl's body, the force of the kick enough to knock her off of Kev and send her sprawling across the ground. She landed on her side, but twisted, unnaturally fast, her head snapping up to glare at us, eyes filled with something dark and feral. We froze as she rose to her feet, moving in jerky, unnatural motions, her limbs bending at odd angles. She hissed, a guttural, animalistic sound that made my blood run cold. "Stay back!" I yelled, grabbing a broken branch from the ground and holding it in front of her. I looked back at Kev, who was gasping for breath. He seemed more shocked than injured, but the girl didn't hesitate. She lunged forward again, faster than before, her claws flashing in the moonlight. Tommy barely managed to dodge, the tips of her claws grazing his arm, tearing through the fabric of his jacket. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm. Tommy's face was pale, his hands shaking as he fumbled in his pocket. Finally, he pulled out his old pocket knife, the blade barely 3 inches long, but it was something. His grip tightened, and he stepped forward, positioning himself between his friends and the girl, his eyes hardening with determination. "Stay away from us," he shouted, brandishing the knife. The girl let out a hiss that was almost a laugh, mocking, filled with an unnatural hunger. She lunged forward, faster than any of us could react. Tommy dodged to the side and swung the knife, the blade slicing through the air and catching her across the arm. Dark blood, too dark, almost black, spilled from the wound, but she didn't stop. She moved closer, relentless, her claws reaching for him. Tommy swung again, this time aiming lower, slicing deep into her side. She let out an inhuman screech, recoiling, her body twisting in pain, but she still didn't fall. Her eyes locked onto Tommy with a searing hatred, her mouth opening in a snarl that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. But Tommy didn't give her another chance. With a surge of adrenaline, he stepped forward, gripping the knife tightly and plunged it into her chest, twisting the blade until her body shuddered and went still. For a moment, her eyes widened in shock, and then her entire body seemed to convulse, her form collapsing in on itself, dark smoke seeping from her mouth and wounds. We watched in horror as the darkness bled from her, her once human face distorting, dissolving into something monstrous before finally disintegrating into the ground, leaving nothing behind but silence and the echo of our panicked breaths. We just stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where she had fallen, trying to process the nightmare we had just survived. Kev's voice broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. What the hell was that?" No one answered because none of us had an answer. We just stood there in silence and tried to process what had just happened. I swallowed hard, glancing around at my friends. Kev was on his knees, clutching his shoulder where the girl's claws had torn into him, his clothes stained with dark red smears. I crouched beside him, extending a hand to help him up. "You good?" I asked. Kev winced but nodded, pulling himself up with my help. "Yeah, just gonna have some scars to show off," he muttered, trying to force a laugh, but it came out shaky. As we staggered back to the car, I realized I was still on a call with my sister. I lifted it to my ear only to hear the faint sound of breathing on the other end. "Casey?" My sister's voice was faint but urgent. What was all that noise?" I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, but let's just say it wasn't pretty. There was this girl. She looked half dead, covered in blood, and then she just changed, her face, her hands, everything, like she was possessed or something. I paused, glancing back at the spot where we'd left the girl's disintegrated remains. I don't know what just happened. "Casey," she whispered, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "You have to be careful. This is bigger than I thought. That thing you saw, it's not the only one. I don't know what's happening, but it's spreading. We saw it too at the party. People we knew, they just started turning, like something was taking over them." She took a shaky breath. "A few of us managed to escape. We're hiding out in the high school gym. It's big enough that we can lock ourselves in and stay safe, for now." I nodded, more to myself than to her, my mind racing. "All right, we're coming to you. Just stay put, all right? Don't open the doors for anyone, not until we get there." We were only a few feet from Greg's car when Tommy, who was walking a few paces ahead, stopped abruptly, his eyes wide. He raised a trembling hand, pointing down the street. My gaze followed, and my blood ran cold. Out in the street, half shrouded in shadow, were more figures. Some crawled along the ground on all fours, their limbs moving with a twisted, animalistic rhythm. Others stood, swaying slightly, their eyes wide and blank, faces twisted into eerie, vacant smiles. Their clothes were torn, bloodied, as though they'd been through the same transformation as the girl we'd just faced. "Oh no," Kev breathed, clutching his shoulder tighter as he backed up against the car. "There's more of them, a lot more." My mind raced, my grip tightening on the phone. "Demi, we're coming, all right?" I said. "We're coming, just hang on." "Casey, please hurry," she replied, her voice breaking with fear. We piled into Greg's car, and as Greg turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life, startling the creatures. Some of them turned toward the sound, their blank, hungry eyes locking onto the car as it idled, headlights casting their twisted forms in stark, horrifying relief. "Floor it, Greg," Tommy said, his voice steely. And without a second thought, Greg hit the gas, the car speeding away from the house, leaving the eerie figures behind in the rearview mirror. But I knew they weren't gone. They were spreading, and the night was far from over. Greg sped through the city streets, the faint glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows across our faces. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a raw, gnawing fear and 100 unanswered questions. I kept my phone clutched tightly in my hand, glancing down at it every few seconds as if my sister might call back with a new warning. Tommy sat next to Kev, popping open the first aid kit that Greg kept in his glove compartment. Rummaging through its contents, some antiseptic wipes, a few bandages, gauze, tape. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He tore open a wipe, the smell of alcohol cutting through the cold night air. Kev winced as Tommy dabbed at his shoulder, biting back a curse. "Man, T, go easy." Tommy shook his head, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You got clawed by a possessed, whatever that was, and this is what hurts? Relax. If I don't clean it, it'll get infected." Tommy gave the bandage a final press, pulling Kev's torn shirt over it. "All right, Kev," he said, dusting his hands off. "That'll hold you together for now. Just try not to rip it open again, all right?" Kev nodded, giving him a grateful smile. "Thanks, man, I owe you one." "You owe us all one," Greg muttered with a smirk, breaking the tension. They all chuckled, though it was more out of relief than humor. "So," Kev started, "we're picking up your sister and a few of her friends. How many, exactly?" I thought back to our conversation. She didn't say exactly, just that they're hiding out in the gym and there's a small group. "Greg, how many can your car fit?" Greg gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the road. "7 if we really squeeze in, so me, you 3, your sister, and maybe 3 others. Any more than that?" He trailed off, giving me a sidelong glance. "We might have to make 2 trips if it comes to that." "2 trips?" Tommy let out a breath. "I don't think we should risk it if we don't have to. We get in, pick them up, and get out of there. It sounds like whatever's happening is getting worse." I nodded, glancing at my friends. "After that, we should check on our families." I looked down at my phone, the screen dark. I haven't heard anything from my parents. I don't even know if they're home right now. One by one, the rest pulled out their phones, each trying to reach someone. Greg called his parents twice, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. Kev's calls to his family were the same. Silence on the other end, broken by the automated message. Each failed attempt only made the weight in my chest feel heavier. "Tommy?" I asked, looking over at him. "Is your uncle at home?" Tommy didn't have parents. They'd passed away when he was little, and he'd been raised by his uncle on a farm out on the outskirts of the city. His uncle didn't come to town much, so it was possible he didn't even know what was happening tonight. Tommy put his phone on speaker, his hand trembling slightly. Finally, his uncle picked up. "Tommy, His voice was calm, warm, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the city. "What are you calling me this late for, son?" "Hey, Uncle Dale," Tommy said, his voice quiet and tense. "I just wanted to check in. Have you heard anything strange tonight?" "Strange?" His uncle's voice held a smile. "No, can't say I have. I've been home all evening, just watching the stars out on the porch. Peaceful as ever out here." There was a pause. "Why, what's got you boys all worked up?" Tommy looked at Kev, then out the window at the empty streets as they passed. I'm in the city right now, but things are weird. People are acting strange. I think there's some kind of emergency." His uncle chuckled. "An emergency? Tommy, what are you talking about?" "You know, I've been telling you kids to stay away from drugs." Tommy clenched his jaw, his face paling. "This isn't a joke, Uncle Dale. It's real. We saw something, and look, if you hear anything strange out there, or if anyone knocks on your door that you don't know, just don't open it, okay? Lock all the doors and stay inside." A silence settled over the call, and Tommy's uncle's voice came back, this time more serious. "All right, Tommy, I'll do that. But where are you now? You need to get somewhere safe." "We're on our way to the high school gym," Tommy replied, "picking up Casey's sister and her friends. Then we're coming back to check on everyone else." "Good. Call me when you're on your way back," his uncle said, his tone stern but calm. "You just take care of yourself, you hear me?" Tommy nodded, as if his uncle could see it. "I will, and you too, Uncle Dale." When he hung up, we were all watching him, his expressions a mix of worry and dread. The empty streets seemed to stretch endlessly before us, each corner and shadow filled with the potential for danger. I could feel the fear tightening my chest, but I tried to focus on my sister's last words. "Just stay safe." "We'll get to the gym, pick them up, and head out of here," I said. "Then we'll check on everyone. But we have to be smart about this. Keep your eyes open, and if anything happens, stick together." They all nodded, and the car fell silent as we turned onto the road leading toward the high school. But as we rounded the last corner, my heart skipped a beat. Standing in the middle of the street, illuminated by the glow of the headlights, were 3 figures. Their heads snapped toward the car, eyes wide, yellow, and hungry. This isn't the end. Things are only getting stranger. If you want to know what happens next, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. Trust me, you won't want to be left in the dark. See you in the next video.